troubled because of these times we're in, where it truly is an emergency anti-war conference, and delighted to be in a room filled with so many people who think that this war is not a good idea. We know that our presence here is urgent, but I want to remind you also that our presence will remain urgent after Iraq and after the year 2003, because American militarism and all that goes along with it is not going away. I want to recognize the organizing committee of the Northeast Ohio Anti-War Coalition, which has organized this conference, and the many dozens of volunteers who have made this possible. You know who you are, and you can see name tags that identify most of those folks. Now we have two keynote speakers here, and we're going to have them speak in turn, and we're going to save questions for after the speakers, and I'll explain that procedure when we get to that point. Our first speaker is Amy Goodman, who will speak on the propaganda war, how the media manipulates the news on Iraq. Amy has a long and distinguished biography. She's one of the most accomplished and controversial radio personalities of contemporary society and a vocal opponent of this war. As the host for the nationally syndicated radio program Democracy Now! In 1998, Ms. Goodman received the George Polk Award for co-producing the radio documentary Drilling and Killing, Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship, in which she exposed the killing of 2 Nigerian villagers. This documentary received the Golden Reel Award for Best National Documentary from the National Federation of Community Broadcasters, and it was named one of the 10 most censored stories of 1998. Truly an illustrious accomplishment. She also wrote about this in The Nation magazine. She's received the Robert Kennedy Prize for the international reporting and the Armstrong Award for her documentary with journalist Alan Nairn, Massacre, the Story of East Timor, in which they themselves survived the massacre. She's reported from Israel, Cuba, Mexico, and Haiti, and was the first journalist to interview Laurie Berenson, a jailed U.S. citizen serving a life sentence in Peru. Aside from her radio show, Ms. Goodman travels around the country speaking on human rights and activism. She spoke at the City Club yesterday, and if you like what you're hearing from Amy here today, you can tune in at 10 a.m., Channel 25, and you will be able to hear her City Club address of yesterday. Yeah, tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning, yes. Amy Goodman.
Thanks. How many of you got to hear yesterday's talk at the City Club? Okay. I wanted to get a sense of what I should repeat and what I shouldn't. But I will talk about a number of the same issues because unfortunately they keep coming up and up. They keep repeating themselves. Yes, history repeating itself. And unfortunately, we have a mainstream media that does not put issues in historical context or look at what has happened in the past for reference to what is happening now. I come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded more than 50 years ago by a conscientious objector soon after World War II. He was concerned after he came out of the detention camps that the media was beating the drums for a third world war because the media is owned by corporations that profit from war. And he said there's got to be a media outlet that is run by journalists and artists, not by corporations, as George Goodman of the Cultural Environment Movement says, not by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, but are raising our children today. And that's how Pacifica was born. We became 5 stations over the next decades. KPFA, the first station in Berkeley, KPFK in Los Angeles, KPFK in Houston, Texas in 1970. WBAI, where I hail from in New York, went on the air in 1960, and WPFW in Washington, D.C. When KPFT went on the air in Houston, Texas in 1970, it was blown up twice by the Ku Klux Klan. When the Grand Dragon went on trial, he said it was his proudest act because he understood how dangerous Pacifica Radio is. Dangerous because Pacifica Radio, People's Radio, the only independent media network in this country, is there to provide a voice for the voiceless, to allow people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking for themselves, it breaks down caricatures and stereotypes that feed the hate that fuels hate groups like the KKK. Yesterday, I was watching the television, watching John Ashcroft talk about the heightened threat in this country, and wondering where this changing of category of alert was coming from. Was there something sudden that we could actually believe? Well, we don't know. They say it's based on secret information. But I was wondering if it was based on something that came out yesterday in the Washington Post. And that was a memo that was leaked, a document from the Justice Department that talked about John Ashcroft and the Justice Department's wanting to expand the USA Patriot Act. And that going on television all day yesterday to blanket the airwaves with the threats against the people of the United States was John Ashcroft's way of taking away media attention or providing justification and scare tactic for the expansion of the USA Patriot Act, which they had denied to Congress members earlier. You may have seen the story in the Washington Post. It says the Justice Department is considering legislative proposals that would significantly expand the federal government's power to investigate, detain, and punish suspected terrorists in secret and without court supervision, according to a preliminary draft of the bill disclosed yesterday. The draft of the potential successor to the Patriot Act that passed Congress after September 11, 2001 attacks would authorize the Justice Department to conduct clandestine searches or eavesdrop on any suspected terrorist or foreign agent for 15 days after the beginning of a military conflict or national emergency, rather than after a formal declaration of war, as current law provides. It would also permit wiretaps of U.S. citizens in terrorism cases for longer periods and with less court oversight than now permitted, and allow the department to collect a DNA sample database from both convicted and suspected terrorists. Under the draft, the government could declare individuals, not just groups, foreign powers, subject to clandestine surveillance under looser standards than would apply in criminal cases, and it would permit such surveillance against a U.S. citizen suspected of spying for a foreign power, even if the alleged suspicious conduct was not in itself criminal. Now, these documents were gotten by the Center for Public Integrity and put on their website on Thursday, and all of this came out on Friday. Yes, it is so important. Yes, it is patriotic to dissent. It is patriotic to protest. And if what they're saying, if they're going to expand the power so that in a time of conflict they can crack down at home even more. Well, we see it already in New York. The largest protest yet is planned for New York on February 15th, just as you plan your protests here in Cleveland, and people plan them around the country for February 15th, joining with those around the world. In that statement, the world says no to war, and the police say they can't march. And will use these kinds of justifications. That is what is endangering American society. And then you look at the justification that is being used for, I won't say imminent invasion of Iraq, because I do not believe it is inevitable. And you look at and listen to Colin Powell's speech, General Colin Powell, who is the Secretary of State before the United Nations. And you look at his citing of the British report also,
saying that they have intelligence as well, that it is absolutely critical, and that Iraq is violating and lying about what they are doing. Which brings us to an article in the New York Times of today that talks about the British report that Colin Powell cited and praised being a plagiarized version of an article written for the Middle East report based in Washington, D.C., the Middle East Review of International Affairs, whose author, Ibrahim al-Marashi, is a postgrad student at Monterey Institute of International Studies in California. And his own report is based on information that he gathered more than 10 years ago. And the reason they know that it was plagiarized right out of his report is that even his typos are repeated in the British report. As the Times says, for instance, the second section of the three-part report, which is described in the Downing Street website as providing up-to-date details of Iraq's network of intelligence and security, was drawn in large part from Iraq's Security and Intelligence Network, a guide, an article about the activities of Iraqi intelligence in Kuwait in 1990 and 1991, which appeared in MERA, the Middle East Review of International Affairs, last September. Mr. Marashi said he was flattered that his report would be made known around the world, just that it was taken a bit out of context. And this is why we have to be very concerned, as the government continually says they have secret information. And occasionally we hear about this very public information that it is culled from, that in the end can be inaccurate, out of context, and yet it may be the reason why many Iraqi children will be dead in just a few weeks. And we have to decide if we are going to allow that to happen. Yesterday at the Cleveland City Club, I told the story of another independent reporter just after World War II and the importance of having independent media that does not toe the line for the administration. Wilfred Burchett, World War II, just after the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he gets on a train and rides for 30 hours to Hiroshima. The rest of the press is on a barge off the coast of Japan covering the Japanese surrender. He gets to Hiroshima, he looks around, he is horrified, doesn't have the words even to describe what he sees, some kind of bomb sickness. He says there's an atomic plague. He sees the imprints of people's shadows on the sides of buildings, and he sees the skin melting off those who have survived at that point, but are running, looking for water, looking to cool off. And he sat down with his Hermes typewriter in the rubble and tapped out the words, "I write this as a warning to the world." Another reporter did get in just after Wilfred Burchett. He was William L. Lawrence from the New York Times, and he also did a 6-part series. Came out later. He was also on the payroll of the Pentagon, in addition to drawing a salary from the New York Times. And his report was headlined, "No radiation sickness, no bomb sickness found in Hiroshima." He won the Pulitzer Prize for his reports. We need independent media, and there is a burgeoning independent media movement in this country. Pacifica Radio is very much, I believe, at the heart of it. There is independent media, indiemedia.org, that is growing all over this country, and there's one right here in Cleveland, and it is wonderful to know and must be supported. There are public access TV stations all over the country that must be used before we lose them, where you can make your own media, where we can find out the truth of people's lives that is not mediated by corporations that profit from war. Is this just rhetoric, or is it real? During the Persian Gulf War, you had CBS, that was owned by Westinghouse at the time. You had NBC, that was owned by General Electric. It still is. Those are two, Westinghouse and General Electric, two of the largest nuclear weapons manufacturers in the world. They own two of the largest networks and most influential networks in this country. Is it any accident that what we saw in the Persian Gulf War was a military hardware show? And then it goes further. Then you have the man who is the spokesperson for the Pentagon who helped craft the press restriction rules on the press during the Persian Gulf War, Pete Williams, Pentagon spokesperson, now is a chief correspondent for NBC, owned by one of the chief weapons manufacturers in the world today. This is the lens through which we see the rest of the world, and it is also the lens through which the rest of the world sees us. We need something else. We need to challenge the mainstream media to tell the truth because they are using the public airwaves just as public media is. Pacifica, NPR, PBS, we are all using the public airwaves, but so is NBC, CBS, and ABC, and they have a responsibility to broadcast the full spectrum of opinion. Which takes us to September 11th, 2001, the day that terror came to U.S. shores. New York and Washington, 3,000 people incinerated in a moment. We were broadcasting just blocks from Ground Zero, Democracy Now!, the program that I have now been doing for almost 7 years. Democracy Now! Is a daily grassroots, national, international human rights news hour, and I hope you all are able to hear it in Ohio very soon. It's totally up to you. We are broadcasting on 120 stations around the country. And now in Cleveland, we're very happy to be broadcasting on WRUW every Tuesday morning at 9 to 10, but we hope that will expand to across the week, Monday through Friday, and also be on community radio stations and NPR stations so that can broadcast all over Ohio. That is up to you. 1 to 2 stations a week are calling us now to broadcast the program. Dennis Moynihan is handing out flyers right now that give you the numbers of the public radio stations and give you our contact information. If you'd like to get more information, you can go to democracynow.org. We also broadcast on shortwave radio, over the internet, and on Dish Network, channel 9415 if you have the dish. It's a free speech, it's called Free Speech TV, and it is a non-profit channel. So using satellite TV as well, and any public access TV station can put a dish on their roof and run us live every day, as more than 70 stations do now around the country. It is a daily television show as well as a radio show. Why is it important? Let's use the example of September 11th. We're broadcasting blocks from Ground Zero, the closest national network to be continually broadcasting on September 11th as the towers went down. We're inside the evacuation zone. 8:47, the first plane hits the first tower of the World Trade Center. We didn't know what had happened. We're in the garret of a 100-year-old firehouse that's now a community media center. 9 o'clock, our show goes on. 9:03, the second plane hits the second tower of the World Trade Center. We hear something, but we're still not sure about what happened, as so many New Yorkers were not sure. We were doing a program that day on the significance of September 11th, 1973. When Salvador Allende died in the palace in Chile, as the Augusto Pinochet regime rose to power, supported by the U.S. government, supported by then the late President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State. Thousands of people died during that reign of that dictator supported by the United States. And we were doing a show that day on the further declassified documents implicating Henry Kissinger. We were talking about terror on that day. And then 3,000 people killed in a moment. We will never know how many people died, because those who go uncounted in life go uncounted in death, and they are the undocumented workers who are working in and around the World Trade Center, whose families are afraid to come forward right now, still, because of the increasingly close relationship between the police and the INS. Afraid that they could be picked up, they could be detained, we would not know their names, we would not know the charges against them, and they could be deported, as so many hundreds of people have been, from this country to places like Pakistan without our knowledge. Is this the country that people are going to fight for? We represent so much better than that, and we must. And we must hear the voices of those who suffered on September 11th here in the United States, in New York, who lost loved ones, who are saying no to war. Because September 11th has been used as an excuse to attack others around the world. September 11th was a horrendous crime against humanity. People like Rita Lasar, who lost her brother Abe Zalmanowitz, knows that pain well. But she saw very quickly how her brother's death was being used. When she heard President Bush give his speech at the National Cathedral in Washington and invoke Abe Zalmanowitz's name as one of the heroes of September 11th. And though he was a hero, Abe Zalmanowitz, Rita said no, and she wrote a letter to the New York Times. She said, "You will not use my brother's name to justify an attack on Afghanistan." She said, "It will not alleviate my suffering to know that a sister in Afghanistan will lose her brother, not in my brother's name." And then there was Phyllis in Orlando. Then there was Phyllis and Orlando Rodriguez, who lost their son, Greg Ernesto Rodriguez, above the 100th floor of the World Trade Center. He died along with 600 other workers of the 900 who worked at Cantor Fitzgerald. And even as they knew the worst pain of their life, they wrote a letter that swirled around the internet. Most of these letters did not get published in the mainstream press, that said, "It will only increase our suffering to know that a mother and father in Afghanistan will know the same pain that we do, not in our son's name." And so many people like them formed an organization called peacefultomorrows.org. You can go to the website and you can see it, and you speak all over the country, and you see the stories of their loved ones in the corporate media. You certainly hear them on Democracy Now! And hear them first there. But when it comes to the second part, where they say no to war, like I might add, the majority of Americans, but when they say no to war, the media cuts away. They'll let them describe their loved ones, to talk about the suffering and pain of September 11th, but when it comes to the second part, what should be done, they cut away and they go to the terrorism experts, people like Henry Kissinger and Oliver North. Well, maybe the corporate media has got it right for once. Terrorism experts, it takes one to know one. And I don't say that lightly. We have to look at Henry Kissinger's record. You look at what happened in Chile with thousands of Chileans dead. You look at what happened in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, more than 2 million Vietnamese dead. And you look at what happened in Timor. In 1975, Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, went with President Gerald Ford to Indonesia, met with Suharto, the long-reigning dictator, and gave the go-ahead for Indonesia to invade East Timor the next day. 90% of the weapons used were from the United States. One of the worst genocides of the 20th century. More than a third of the population of Timor was wiped out. And when Henry Kissinger came back to the United States a few days later, his State Department officials had sent him cables saying, "This is bloody, we will not be able to justify Indonesia's invasion of Timor using US weapons." And he called them together and he castigated them. And he said, "We will not leave a paper trail. We will not kick our ally in the teeth." Yes, I do believe Osama bin Laden and his allies should be tried for what happened on September 11th, be tried in an international criminal court, but I also believe that Henry Kissinger should be tried. Very quickly, because I know the time is limited. We have to have a uniform standard of justice. If not, this country will not be safe because of the anger that is generated around the world of an attitude that says, we can try you, but not us. We will not hold ourselves to the same standard. We must make the world safer. There is no question about it. We must reduce the threats. We must rout out terror. The answer to September 11th is not the chant that went up around George Bush when he came to Ground Zero several days after that date. USA, people chanted, USA. No. The answer is a global community united against terror. When I was at the firehouse those next few days, we never left the Democracy Now! Team because we continued to broadcast, doing the only thing we really knew how, the daily broadcasts of Democracy Now! And at night I would walk out and see the workers coming from the World Trade Center, those that were trying to recover bodies and begin the cleanup, covered in the ash that we all came to know so well. and their hacking coughs that they still suffer from today, as the U.S. government denies the level of toxins that were in that environment that tens of thousands of people inhaled. My co-host Juan Gonzalez, who co-hosts Democracy Now! With me, one of the leading reporters in New York, who's a columnist at the New York Daily News, did the leading expose on the toxic soup that people lived in at Ground Zero for so long. But when I walked around those first few nights and saw those color photographs going up, the color Xeroxes of photographs of people lost at the World Trade Center, hundreds, thousands of them taped up all over New York City, when they said things like, a picture of a man holding his daughter, and they would say, if you have seen my son, last seen above the 70th floor of the World Trade Center, please call his mother, and we give her number. If you have seen my daughter, picture of the daughter, please call her father, and give that phone number. I thought about the pictures that are carried by the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina as they walk around the Plaza de Mayo, those same placards. Have you seen my granddaughter? Have you seen my grandson? On September 11th, we were united with people all over the world who have known terror all too well. Unfortunately, in many of those cases, it is because of the U.S. government supporting military regimes that have terrorized their own populations. And we have to put an end to that. We have to look at what's happening here at home, what's justifying a crackdown on dissent so that people in this country are afraid to speak out at a time when it will save innumerable lives to speak out, and it is our patriotic duty to not only speak up, but to stand together, to march, and to say no to the killing of innocent civilians anywhere. Think about it, after September 11th, the media personalities, you can't call them journalists, kept intoning this 90% figure. 90% of Americans are opposed to war. I never believed, sorry, it said 90% of Americans are for war. I never believed it for a minute. Were any of you asked? And if you were, whatever these polls were, what was the question that people were asked? Were they asked, do you believe the killing of innocent civilians should be avenged by the killing of innocent civilians? More than 90% of Americans would have said no. Americans are a compassionate people. And that is how the media beat the drums for war. The polls all show it now. More than half the population of this country is opposed to war. More than 60% of Republicans are opposed to war. The big untold story, the level of opposition and resistance in the military opposed to war. And yet, we don't see it reflected in the mainstream media. I was just told after giving the Cleveland City Club address that there was no mention of it in the Cleveland Plain Dealer today. And the person who told me this said he has long monitored the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and there's always a report on the address given at the Cleveland City Club. I spoke against war yesterday.
Time for letters to the PD.
It is absolutely critical that we build our own media, but that we hold the mainstream media accountable. We are seeing what's happening in this country. I'm going to read just a few words from, believe it or not, William Safire, the speechwriter for Richard Nixon, describing what's going on here at home, even though I have zero time left. And I'm not going to end on his words. But William Safire wrote a piece called You Are a Suspect. And he said, if the Homeland Security Act is not amended before passage, and it wasn't, this is what will happen. Every purchase you make with a credit card, every magazine subscription you buy and medical prescription you fill, every website you visit and email you send or receive, every academic grade you receive, every bank deposit you make, every trip you book, every event you attend, all these transactions and communications will go into what the Defense Department describes as a virtual, centralized, grand database. to this computerized dossier on your private life from commercial sources at every piece of information the government has about you, passport application, driver's license, bridge toll records, judicial and divorce records, complaints from nosy neighbors to the FBI, your lifetime paper trail, plus the latest hidden camera surveillance, and you have the Super Snoop's dream, a total information awareness about every U.S. citizen. And who is the man in charge? It is John Poindexter. Sapphire writes, remember Poindexter? Brilliant man, first in his class at the Naval Academy, later earned a doctorate in physics, rose to National Security Advisor under President Ronald Reagan, had this brilliant idea of secretly selling missiles to Iran to pay ransom for hostages and with the illicit proceeds to illegally support Contras in Nicaragua. A jury convicted Poindexter in 1990 on 5 felony counts of misleading Congress and making false statements. And now this man is realizing his 20-year dream, getting the data mining power to snoop on every public and private act of every American. And you add to that the proposal of the Justice Department under John Ashcroft to extend even the USA Patriot Act. These are very frightening times, times when people must stand up. They have now put librarians on the front lines of the battle for freedom in this country. Why? Because Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act says that FBI with warrants can go into libraries and bookstores in this country and ask, does anyone come in with a foreign accent? What are they asked to read? Let us see the records. They can go to the internet files. They can look at the books. They can look at the records. And the librarian has to hand this over, and they cannot tell anyone else about it, including a fellow librarian, unless they need to get the information from another librarian. And if they say a word, they can be prosecuted. These are very frightening times, and the American Library Association has made very strong statements against this and also said that they have a computer program where if you get your book back on time, your name is erased from their records after a very brief period of time. I told them I think this would be a fantastic ad campaign for libraries around the country. Get your books back on time. But I'm not going to end with the words of William Sapphire, though his warning is very important. We must speak out. But also, I'd rather end with the words of my brother, David Goodman, who did a piece in Mother Jones called No Child Unrecruited. Should the military be given the names of every high school student in America? And this is something that most people know nothing about. David writes, Sharon Shea Keneally, principal of Mount Anthony High School in Bennington, Vermont, was shocked when she received a letter in May from military recruiters demanding a list of all her students, including names, addresses, and phone numbers. The school invites recruiters to participate in career days and job fairs, but like most school districts, it keeps student information strictly confidential. She said, we don't give out a list of names of our kids to anybody, not to colleges, churches, employers, nobody. But when Shea Keneally insisted on an explanation, she was in for an even bigger surprise. The recruiters cited the No Child Left Behind Act, President Bush's sweeping new education law passed earlier this year. There, buried deep within the law's 670 pages, is a provision requiring public secondary schools to provide military recruiters not only with access to facilities, but also with contact information for every student or face a cutoff of federal aid. The military complained this year that up to 15% of the nation's high schools are problem schools. I always thought problem schools where kids couldn't read or write. No, problem schools are where the military can't recruit. Add that to the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, and recruiting? I don't think so. But that's what the military thinks they have been empowered to do right now. And the congressman who inserted this clause, Congressman Vitter of Louisiana, said that such schools demonstrate an anti-military attitude that I thought was offensive. And so they inserted the passage in the act and it was passed. What the principal in Vermont said is that more than a sixth of the student body, 200 students at her school, have asked that their records be withheld. And that's the option that can be chosen. Yes, parents or students can tell the school proactively, I don't want my kids' information passed on, and the school cannot pass it on. But you have to know this to do it. It is critical you get this information. Recruiters are upfront about their plans to use school lists to aggressively pursue students through mailings, phone calls, and personal visits, even if parents object. Says Major Johannes Parran, head U.S. Army recruiter for Vermont and northeastern New York, the only thing that will get us to stop contacting the family is if they call their congressman, or maybe, if the kid died, we'll take them off our list. It is critical that you get this information and that you have media that gets this information to you. You must demand of your local paper and your TV networks, because they are the most influential in determining public opinion, not only that they start covering the protests of thousands of people that are taking place around the country, in fact, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands in our nation's capital, as well as in Europe, the level of protest there, millions have protested against war. It is not only imperative that they be honest about what is happening in this country and here in Cleveland, but it is also important that when they are doing the daily drumbeat stories for war about military going off, about what's happening, about what the Pentagon and State Department are saying, that they include the voices of peace activists and peace leaders on those front page stories, just as they include the quotes of the military and the politicians who are for war, because the fact is that we are not talking about a fringe minority of people who are against war. We're not even talking about the silent majority. We are talking about the silenced majority, silenced by the mainstream media. Go to where the silence is. I will just end by saying, if you want daily coverage of grassroots voices around the world in discussion and in debate with those in power, with ground reports, groundbreaking reports on the ground in Iraq, with our correspondent Jeremy Scahill, who continues to risk his life, not in the planes and on the barges and on the aircraft carriers where the rest of the media is joining with the military, but at the other end, at the target end, where journalists should be, showing us what it is like to be at the other end, within the sights of the most powerful arsenal on earth. The media would be much more accurate instead of portraying a target on the forehead of Saddam Hussein, showing that target on the forehead of a little Iraqi girl, because that's who will die in war. The overwhelming majority of people who die in war are innocent civilians. You can get Democracy Now!, this daily national broadcast, on your public radio station as well as your public access station. Just call. You've got the papers that show you how to do that. Most importantly, support all independent media, the indie media centers, support public access TV, support your public radio station, and challenge the mainstream media. Go to where the silence is and say something. Thank you very much.
I've been told to announce this since some people may be leaving after hearing Amy Goodman, although there's lots more to come. Next Saturday, February 15th, if you're not going to New York for the big demonstration, Clevelanders will assemble at Trinity Cathedral at 12 noon and march downtown to the Federal Building and back. 12 noon, Trinity Cathedral next Saturday. Those of you who are standing in the back, it may not look like it, but there are a number of seats down here, so feel free to come on down and take a seat in the audience. Okay? Our next speaker is David Soul, who will speak on the real reasons for the U.S. war on Iraq and the war's impact here at home. David is the president of United Auto Workers Local 2334 in Detroit. He traveled to Iraq in 1998 as part of the Iraq Sanctions Challenge with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, Bishop Thomas Gumbleton, and others, taking over $4 million in medicines to children's hospitals in Baghdad. He is the coordinator of the Michigan Emergency Committee Against the War in Iraq. Please welcome David Soul.
Good afternoon, and thank you. First, before I start, I want to pay my respects to a veteran anti-war activist right here in Cleveland who's unable to join us this afternoon. Frances Dostal is undergoing heart surgery this week, and years ago she inspired me during the Vietnam period with her stories of protest against the Korean War. I hope all our prayers are with her. I want to ask, what is most remarkable about the current period we're in? Is it that the President of the United States has mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops, hundreds of airplanes, ships, thousands of cruise missiles, and is threatening, I won't call it a war, let's call it what it is, a massacre of a virtually defenseless people in a former colonial nation of Iraq? But, you know, that's not new. The United States military might has been used not too long ago in Korea, Vietnam, Panama, Grenada, and openly and covertly hundreds of other times around the world. Is it that the United States is so openly going after the natural resources of an independent nation, in this case 10 billion barrels of oil reserves in Iraq? No, it's not that. That's not new. President Eisenhower spoke up in his memoirs about the early intervention in Vietnam, citing that it was tin, tungsten, and rubber that the U.S. was after there. Is it that the United States mass media is in virtual lockstep with the Pentagon and the State Department in a propaganda campaign that would make Goebbels proud? No, anyone who examines the corporate ownership of the mass media knows that the same banks and corporations that profit from war also hand out the daily ration of what people are supposed to swallow and believe each day. Is it that Congress, except for a very few, suffers from the fatal lack of spine syndrome? Well, we just have to ask who finances these legislators' expensive campaigns. Who has hundreds, even thousands of lobbyists camped out throughout Washington? Who controls the media, ready to destroy the career of any wayward voice on the Hill, or destroy it in a campaign by sending massive amounts to their opponents? Well, it sure ain't us. And during the Vietnam War, inside Congress was the last place we looked to find a protest. Is it that the United Nations can't stand up to the United States? As far back as the early 1960s, President Sukarno of Indonesia called upon the non-aligned countries of the world, the vast majority of nations, to pull out of the United Nations and form their own United Nations. Of course, he was later deposed in 1965 by a CIA-led coup, followed by the slaughter of 1 million Indonesian people over a period of months, much like in Chile, but on 10 times the size of that, if not 100 times the size of that. Followed by the invasion of Indonesia by Nike and other U.S. corporations using virtual slave labor. And when we talk about crimes of Saddam Hussein that are blared out over and over, when was the last time anyone heard anything in the media about the crime that was carried out in Indonesia in 1965? You'll look hard and far and you won't find it. So what is remarkable in this whole dreary replay of U.S. imperialism's arrogant plan of aggression? It is this: despite the propaganda, bolstered by the hysteria and the real fears of people in this country following September 11th, the fact is the people of the United States are not buying this. Think about it. It's only a little over 1 year since 9/11. The mass progressive movement of this country, and you all felt it, we were thrown off our feet virtually with the hysteria and the mass propaganda and the shock of it all. Yet, only 2 weeks after that, 15 to 20,000 people did demonstrate in Washington to say no to the war in Afghanistan and to the repression. And the Bush program, nonetheless, the Bush program was rammed down the throat of a pliant Congress, and Bush's henchmen, some of the most rabid racists, sexist, homophobic right-wingers, felt completely uninhibited in that time to spout their line. And now, it seems to me like we're in a forest that has been burned down. At first, all seems destroyed, and yet in a remarkably short time, everywhere you look, sprouting up is new growth. And that is our movement. We were all pleasantly surprised when several 100,000 people marched on October 26th in D.C. and San Francisco against the threatened war on Iraq. But on January 18th, the turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. There hasn't been a showing against war like that since the height of the Vietnam War movement. And February 15th will prove it all over again. Sisters and brothers, to be honest, we, the anti-war activists, and I know many of you in this room are, we can't take all the credit. Nobody can make a mass movement. We can only help it along. But the American people in their gut sense that this is an unjust war. Many realize it's a war for oil profits, that it's a war for empire. One could certainly say that there's a mass revulsion to this war in the country. Even Colin Powell in the UN couldn't sell it. And when did Colin Powell become the exponent of peace? This is the guy who started his career covering up the My Lai massacre for Nixon in Vietnam. What is also different is that this war is taking place during an economic recession. And you know, they used to call these things depressions, right? But if you go back to the 30s, that was the new word then. The depression was a word because before that they called them crashes. So we're in an economic recession. And remember, the Vietnam protests took place during a boom. But now millions in this country are losing their jobs, despite the enormous military budget. Tens of thousands are losing their pensions in bankruptcy, as in National Steel, which has gone into bankruptcy. The Federal Pension Guarantee Board took over their pensions and proceeded to cut it from $1,700 a month to $1,300 a month. Imagine working your lifetime in steel mill, at the blast furnace, and having your pension cut like that. And what is this, the Pension Guarantee Board? Guaranteeing what? These things are all misnamed. They need to be renamed. That's only one case. Of course, Enron was even more outrageous, where the executives took hundreds of millions of dollars personally in their pockets while they left their workers without pensions. Many millions upon millions in this country lack medical coverage. It's a national disgrace, and it's a cause of growing anger in the land as people watch huge appropriations in the federal budget go entirely to bolster the Pentagon in this coming war. Every state of this union is suffering enormous budget deficits, and that budget deficit axe is being wielded to slash more and more critical public services, and not many of them are left, by the way. Education and healthcare are being targeted in every state. And yet Bush, in his new budget message, has offered nothing, not a penny, to the states to assist them, or to the cities. To give you an example of the results of this, there are 15,000 city workers in the city where I'm from, in Detroit. The mayor has offered a 5-year contract to those 15,000 workers that guarantees 0, 0, 0, 0, and 0 wage increases for 5 years. That's not the worst. Those are people who have jobs. 50,000 people in Detroit have had their water cut off in the last year. Can you imagine? For inability to pay their bills. And then Bush gets up in front of everyone and proposes ending taxes on dividends. Taxes on dividends. That's the mainstay for the rich people here. You know, if you own a stock or two, you're lucky. But that's where the rich have most of their wealth invested. And it's a proposal that would make Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette proud. This is the ground upon which we're building a new type of anti-war movement. It's not just a moral crusade for peace. It must be and will be a movement that fundamentally links the budget cuts and the attacks on poor and working people right here at home with the bloated Pentagon budget and tax breaks for the rich. It's a movement that shows the hidden hand of the banks and the big corporations who are making the very survival of hundreds of millions of people in this country less and less possible. At the same time, those hands manipulate the government, the media, and the military to launch wars of economic and political domination abroad. And we must oppose this war because it is also a war against us. Next Saturday, February 15th, in solidarity with the National March in Washington and the worldwide protest, Detroiters will be gathering in a park in downtown Detroit, and I'm part of the organizing committee for that. We'll be gathering, and there's a statue at the gathering point that most people probably won't notice. It's of a former governor of Detroit, of Michigan, named Hazen S. Pingree. They never teach this person in the schools, of course. But if you read the plaque that's been sitting there ignored for all these years, it says that he was the governor in the 1890s in Michigan, and he warned against the dangers of the big corporations. Turns out he was a populist or People's Party, third-party governor in a movement that swept this country in the 1890s. And that movement also encompassed, because the corporations, as you know, grew up very strongly in that period, that period also saw what was called the Anti-Imperialist League. It was formed in 1898 when the U.S. launched its domination on the world scene with a war against Spain and took over the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba. And in addition, it wasn't just a university movement or a middle-class movement. It was a labor movement. And they don't teach this in schools either. You got to go to the library and find these old books that have things like this in there. But the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, passed a resolution in December of 1898. And it says, whereas, as a result of the war with Spain, a new and far-reaching policy, commonly known as imperialism or expansion, is now receiving the attention of the national government, and if ratified by the United States Senate, will seriously burden the wage workers of our country, thrust upon us a large standing army and an aristocratic navy, and seriously threaten the perpetuity of our republic. Therefore be resolved. And they go on to oppose it. This from the National Labor Movement at the time, which was in alliance with the Anti-Imperialist League, a broader movement that also formed that year. And very interesting, I'll just give you this quote. It said in its manifesto, "It will be time enough to think of governing others overseas, when we have shown that we can protect the rights of men and women within our own borders," and this is their language, "like the colored races of the South and the Indians of the West, and that we can govern great cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago." Well, change the wording a little bit, and it's very familiar language. Because our movement can do no less than was tried in 1898 at the beginning of U.S. imperialism. It must be a movement that is as outspoken against every manifestation of racism, union busting, and oppression of lesbians and gay people as it is against war. because only that type of movement can unite us in the tens of millions and prevent us from becoming victims of balkanization, where each group is turned against each other, while those who see right Mills, someone else they don't teach in the schools anymore, called the power elite, but who I saw comedian George Carlin the other night call it by its name, the ruling class, while they run to the bank. The people of this country are against this war, but that alone won't stop Bush any more than the people being for national health care was able to persuade and push Clinton to develop a national health care plan. That's because we're unorganized, to be honest, and that's where we, the activists, come in. Everywhere across this country, people are coming together. In colleges and high schools, in every city, town, and village. I had the honor of participating in a historic meeting of 100 labor leaders in Chicago on January 11th, where a national organization called U.S. Labor Against the War was founded. A very significant preliminary development. And you know, throughout the entire Vietnam War, this had never happened. Churches are sprouting up with anti-war committees. Wherever you turn, individuals are stepping forward to take on the tasks at hand. Some of us have been doing this for 30, 40, maybe 50 years. But the majority have never marched before, never written a leaflet, and never given a speech. They're getting on-the-job training, as it were. With the help of some of us veteran anti-war activists, perhaps our movement won't stumble as much, and may move ahead more smoothly and quickly. But it's already an amazing sight, brothers and sisters. So much so that the New York Times had to editorialize 2 days after the January 18th demonstration, warning Bush to pay attention to this movement because it represented the mainstream of America. Well, I have to be honest with you, I feel uncomfortable when I'm referred to as mainstream. But it's not because I've moved to the mainstream. It's because that stream has shifted its course and moved towards what many of us have long predicted would happen. Of course, that editorial didn't stop the New York Times a few days later from running an article denouncing the entire movement as a communist conspiracy. But the New York Daily News, not to be outdone, did them one better, and ran an article claiming that, based on secret information the U.S. government provided, that Iraqi spies were behind the process. So look around you, they're probably mixed in with you here, those Iraqi spies. Hold on, sisters and brothers, it's going to be a wild ride. We can count on repression. No movement ever developed without its repression and the red baiting. We can count on disinformation and COINTELPRO disruptions, but no real mass movement just grows smoothly and progressively. But we will grow. Why? Because this outrageous, illegal, yes, imperialist war is not the least bit in the interest of the vast majority people of the United States. And more people, wherever you turn, here at home, are seeing that the government of the United States, shocking, does not have their interests at heart. And it is shocking to some of them. Let me tell you, when I was a teenager, I was shocked that President Lyndon Johnson turned out to be a liar. And it moved me and part of the rest of that stream over. And it's moving a lot of people now. It's our enormous task and a great honor for us in these days ahead, weeks ahead, maybe years ahead, to build a movement that will start with rallies and demonstrations and leaflets and marches, to go on to actually make this country ungovernable and bring peace and justice to the country here at home and to the world abroad. Thank you.
I want to read a statement from Stephanie Tubbs-Jones, the Honorable Stephanie Tubbs-Jones, our congressperson right here in this district, who's not able to be here. And she writes, I regret that I'm unable to join you today as you protest the war in Iraq. Please know that I'm fully supportive of your efforts and that I too oppose going to war in Iraq. As you may know, just this week I began my service on the Ways and Means Committee, and I asked Secretary of Treasury Richard Snow whether dollars had been allocated for war in Iraq in the President's budget. I asked the same thing of the Director of the Office of Budget and Management. Both of them opined that the President had decided not to go to war. We know that money has been expended to pay for this buildup in the Middle East, yet the representatives of the President are unwilling to tell the American people how much has been or will be spent on the war. As your representative, I will continue to push this administration to explain to the American people the parameters of this war, the financial cost, the possible human loss and cost, the length of our commitment, the number of forces we will commit, and our plan for withdrawal. We must continue to speak up, to speak out, to step up, and to step out against the war. All of America is counting on us. Thank you, Stephanie Tubbs-Jones. I'm told that Representative Sherrod Brown is here, and I'd like to recognize him. It costs a lot of money to fight war, and it costs rather less money to oppose it. Now, I want to point out to you right at this moment that it cost about $2,000 to put this conference on, and the Northeast Ohio Anti-War Coalition has a tradition basically of passing the hat at events like this to cover expenses. This is a free conference. Well, not really. I figure a conference like this might cost about $10. And I think, looking around the room, if each of you gave $10, or a little more or less based on ability to pay, that we would more than cover expenses here and push the further work of NOAC into the future, at least through next week and next month. So I think, how are we circulating? Okay, here comes the proverbial can. And please put your donations in that can to support this good work. Now, I want to explain the ground rules for the question and answer period here. There are 2 microphones, one in each aisle, and if you have a question or a comment, a question for one of the panelists here, one of the keynote speakers, or if you have a comment, you should feel free to do that. But we have limited time, so I am going to limit your comments, or you should, so I don't have to 2 minutes. And the speakers will be limited to 4 minutes in their response. Michael?
Testing. Yeah, we're on. I have a question for Amy Goodman. I heard your speech the other day at the City Club, and it was excellent. I was wondering, you talked quite a bit about the stolen election, and I was wondering if you had a comment on the fact that the City Club of Cleveland this coming March will be presenting its Citadel of Freedom Award to Justice Antonin Scalia.
No comment. Jerry.
Yes, I want to make a few comments about the February 15th demonstration. The Northeast Ohio Anti-War Coalition has never accepted the proposition that this war is inevitable, and we never will. And if it happens, we'll deal with it then. But for right now, we're pouring all of our energies into preventing the war. You may have heard the comment by the French diplomat. Bush said the game is over. French diplomat, and there's a great big anti-war movement in France. French diplomat said it's not a game and it's not over. Now, the demonstrations for Saturday, February 15th, were initiated by the anti-war movement in Europe, and it has spread all across the globe, and it has caught on. And we expect on next Saturday a tidal wave of opposition to this war to be demonstrated in the streets of cities around the world that will surpass anything we have seen so far. We'll be marching in lockstep with everybody around the world, and it's an exciting day. Now, you know, Bush had his day when he gave his State of the Union address, and Powell had his day on Wednesday before the United Nations. Next Saturday, that's going to be our day, the anti-war movement's day. Now, whether you go to Trinity, and that's going to be at noon, and there will be an indoor rally from 12:30 to 2. It's going to be followed by a march to the Federal Building, and we have a permit for the plaza. And we can fill that plaza because that's Bush's office in Cleveland. There's plenty of room. Or whether you go to New York on a bus for the demonstration there, you got to be out on that day and talk to friends and neighbors, co-workers, students, people you pray with. Bring one person along. There's 500 people here today. Think about it. If everyone here convinced one other person to come, and that person in turn convinced one other, well, you get the picture. We'll have thousands here in Cleveland and big demonstration in New York. And bring your children. We have permits, peaceful, legal, orderly march. Finally, on the leaflet front, we have 10,000 leaflets here today, ready for distribution. We ordered 10,000, and then we got a phone call that John Ryan, Executive Secretary of the Cleveland AFL-CIO, wanted 2,500 more for distribution, so we ordered that. And we'll order as many thousands more as we need. If we run out, just call us, because we're pulling out all the stops. This is crunch time, and we should all use every waking hour to convince everyone we know to be out there next Saturday. We leave no stone unturned to galvanize the largest possible turnout of people so that the demand no war for oil is heard all across this land on Saturday and all across the world.
Okay, this is a question for Amy Goodman. Okay, it concerns the alleged accomplices of the tragedy of 9/11. I heard a news report that the Bush administration wants the trial of Zacarias Moussaoui to be put on hold because if he speaks to an Al-Qaeda operative whose name I don't remember, that some very sensitive information might come out. Okay, it should be noted that the Moussaoui trial has had almost no coverage at all by the news media, and that the trial is going on in closed door sessions. The question is this: have you, Amy Goodman, heard anything as to the motive of the Bush administration?
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
As to why they want to put this trial on hold. Thank you.
I also hear that they're interested in putting it into a military tribunal, and that's of grave concern, not only for Zacarias Moussaoui, but for all of us. The whole issue of naming people as enemy combatants so that they won't be tried in U.S. courts. We have built this system over many years in this country, And when you put someone into a military tribunal, nothing goes according to the rules of evidence or what we understand as a fair trial. It's the first time they've talked about this issue of enemy combatants. You now have, with the laws that have passed since September 11th, people who could be tried on a military barge off a foreign country, U.S. military barge. We don't know their names. We don't know the charges against them because they say that there are secret charges based on secret evidence. They can be convicted by a military tribunal. They can be sentenced to death, and they can be thrown overboard. We would never even know their names. That's not an exaggeration. That's how the whole military tribunal and these special courts that they're talking about setting up can work. And we have to decide, is that what we want an American court to be? And I think it's very important, just as Ashcroft moves toward cracking down, that we say no.
This question is also for Ms. Goodman. In my humble opinion, there's a lot of parallels between the ongoing war against Iraqi society that's going on and the Israeli war against Palestinian society and the infrastructure of Palestinian society, with parallels between Bush's talk about terrorism and comparing Hussein to Hitler, and Ariel Sharon's constant demonizing of Arafat and comparing him to Hitler. Yesterday, after your excellent talk at the City Club, a gentleman in the audience I heard on the radio said something to you, something like, do you feel that the American people is responding as forthrightly to the terrorist threat from 9/11 as the Israeli people are responding to Palestinian terrorism? And while I have no great sympathy for suicide bombings and other terrorist acts, it seemed like you paused when they asked you that and you didn't really take a critical approach toward what Israel is doing to Palestinian society. I might have misunderstood you, but I was wondering if you had any comments.
I don't think he talked about Palestinian terrorism, but I might have not heard that. I think, you know, one of the things I talked about yesterday was my own background, that I'm the daughter and the granddaughter of an Orthodox rabbi, and how important I do believe it is for American Jews to speak out against what's going on in the occupied territories and what the Israeli military is doing. I have been there. I was there at the beginning of the Intifada, the first Intifada. I didn't think it could last any longer. I thought that it was going to end very quickly, only because the occupation, I didn't feel, could last much longer, given how repressive the situation was. And it was horrifying for me, raised in a religious Jewish family, to see the symbols of religion that I took as symbols of education and social justice, like the Star of David, to be draped over Israeli military tanks. I was shocked when I saw that. Of course, it is the flag of Israel, the Star of David, and that's what's draped over the tanks. The occupation has to end. I mean, I have always felt if the U.S. press paid as much attention to Palestinians who have died over the years as they do to Israelis who have died, that we would see nothing like the number of Israelis who have died today. What I mean by this is, you know, the New York Times has the profiles, portraits of grief of everyone who died on September 11th, and they continue. And it's very important. You get to a sort of snapshot of each life that was snuffed out on that day. And if we saw that kind of coverage of the Palestinians who have died over the years, I really do believe Americans are compassionate people, and they would say, what is happening here? How could this be done? And especially when they hear that it is done with a military that is fully supported by the United States, in fact, Israel being the largest recipient of U.S. aid, that people would balk and they would say, we have to stop this. And that it is up to the U.S. press to tell the truth about what is happening in the occupied territories. That has always been my stance on Democracy Now! We cover extensively what is going on there. We were the first to report on Saraida Saleh, who is the Palestinian American. She was 21 years old, and she was killed by Israeli troops in Ramallah. Now, the operative word here, unfortunately, is American. Because when an American dies in Israel, it is absolutely front page news when a Jewish American or Israeli American dies there. Her story was that she was terrified. It was late at night, about 4:30 in the morning, and she asked her husband to drive her and her one-year-old baby to her father's house just down the road. Total crackdown then in Ramallah. And they got in the car they were driving. Israeli troops stopped them, and they shot point blank at her, killed her. Her husband was shot up, but he did not die. Her husband grabbed the baby from her lap and made his way, crawled to the father's house, who was just down the road. It took forever for the ambulances to come, both for the husband and for the dead wife. She was taken to Ramallah Hospital. They couldn't bury people. They just filled up the morgue refrigerator until finally, because they were so desperate, they couldn't get to the hospital. They couldn't get to the cemetery, the hospital workers. They just dug up the parking lot and buried dozens of people in the Ramallah Hospital parking lot, as well as Saretta Saleh. We heard this story, we broadcast it, we interviewed her father, and he said he's been pleading. She was born in Washington, D.C. He's been pleading with the American Embassy to do something, to come out to them, and they hadn't done anything. She was an American, the first Palestinian American to die there in the Second Intifada. And we called the State Department, and they knew that she had died. Then the New York Times and Washington Post, and then the next day, after we basically led a kind of press campaign, we put the transcript of the interview on our website. We urged listeners to send the transcript around and to call the press, to let them know about the story. Our motto is, please steal the story. And finally, soon every newspaper and magazine was calling. And the next day, Christiane Amanpour of CNN was in front of Saretta Saleh's father's house in Ramallah and said, we're here to report that an American has died in Ramallah today. And then they interviewed her father. But it is absolutely imperative that we make the media honest on this issue.
With reference to our questions, Representative Sherrod Brown would like to make a comment.
Francis, thank you. Amy and Dave, thank you for coming to Cleveland. I admire all of you for leaving your house during the orange alert. Thank you for your courage. David and Amy, Cleveland's a dangerous place, so we should thank you. Many of you were very involved in helping us on the Brown-Kine letter and getting 120-some members of Congress to sign it, including 29 members of Congress who had voted for the original Iraq resolution to get them to sign it. It's really the involvement. It's the involvement of so many people that made that happen. I mean, it happened in the space of about 2 weeks because of the internet and because so many of you went and called your members of Congress and called your friends in other places and did the same thing. I will take no more than 2 minutes. I just want to urge you to continue what you're doing as all of us that talk about this, and all of you are talking about it in your workplaces, in your church, in your schools, in your homes, in your neighborhoods. People raise suspicions about your patriotism, and you've heard that. I've heard that. I was on a MSNBC sort of little mini debate that, those things that each get 5 minutes kind of thing back and forth, and the moderators sort of question my patriotism, and that's even though 70% of the American public doesn't want this war. And I represented my old congressional district before redistricting. George Bush carried, and my mail was 28-1 against it. That's not even counting Oberlin. And it's so important, particularly if Bush does what we're afraid he's going to do, that you turn it up even more, because members of Congress are going to be under a lot of pressure to support our troops in the field and to vote for more money for our troops in the field. And the Bush administration will release information. It may not be true, but they will release information that the troops aren't well enough outfitted with gas masks and everything else, and there will be more and more pressure in Congress, and anyone that speaks out and says the best thing to do to support the troops is bring them home, people that say things like that. people who say things like that are going to have their patriotism questioned. So this is a Congress, obviously, without enough spine, and you can be the spine in this Congress in doing this all over the country. And I know that Amy has been lots of places showing a lot of courage and getting the media to cover so much of what's happened in Iraq the last 10 years and so much about American foreign policy around the world that brings into question so much of our values that we say we hold at home, that we don't practice at home that well and practice abroad even worse. And it's important that all of us step it up, not just before the attack, if he does attack, but continue that and don't give up and keep doing what you're doing, because we need you now more than ever.
Okay, we have 7 minutes. Questions and comments to 30 seconds, please.
Well, I'd just like to thank the panelists for coming to Cleveland today. And my main question was about Democracy Now's website through Free Speech TV. And can you only get past episodes now from last year? Because I haven't been able to get anything past like December 25th.
Are you talking about radio or
Yeah.
TV?
Well, I go through Free Speech TV's website.
No, just go
get
to
Now.
democracynow.org and you can get any program we've done.
All right, that's my only question. I'll let you get to other
Yeah.
people. Thanks.
I'm on several anti-war mailing lists, and I was made aware of a site called www.targetoil.org, and it talks about nonviolent actions at gas stations throughout the country, and also which gas stations in particular should be targeted, BP Amoco, Chevron, and several others. And it also announced that Citgo is using exclusively Venezuelan oil right now. They're no longer using oil from the Middle East, so patronize Citgo gas stations.
Hi. I didn't hear either of the speakers today talk about the enormous amount of evidence there is that people in the government actually allowed 9/11 to happen, and I think it's extremely important for this information to be talked about, because otherwise we're only reacting to this basically fascist government, a government that's here to instill rule of corporations. There's a lot of evidence, I'm sure people have heard this, that there are connections between the CIA and Osama bin Laden as he was fighting in Afghanistan against the Russians, and there's more evidence of these links even now, even financial links. Somebody mentioned Moussaoui before. Moussaoui had, when his trial was open in public or reported on, he said this. He said that as part of his defense of himself, he said the American government wanted this to happen. And I think.
Okay, let's.
Okay, let me just say, I left some flyers out on the table out there that advertise for this book called The War on Freedom, and that's one of many pieces of media that outlines these kinds of arguments and evidence, and I hope many people pick those up.
I would just say that I think September 11th has to be fully investigated, and that Henry Kissinger should not be the one who's doing the investigation. But I do think that there should be an investigative commission to set up that would investigate Henry Kissinger as well.
Yeah, I'm a member of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, and I work in a slaughterhouse west of here, and there's growing amounts of interference by the INS under the so-called war against terror, against immigrant workers in particular, those involved in union activities and so on. That's part and parcel of the war against the people of the world. And I think defending immigrant rights and preventing this division of the working people in this country is a critical part of this. I don't think this war can be stopped. I think it's begun already. I think it's going to be part of many wars, and that the only solution really is to fight for a different kind of power in this country and around the world. So I think I just was curious about what are the activities planned of this labor committee, again, whatever you said, because I know that there's a lot of working people and union members who would be interested in building things like that.
I think that's a question that may be answered in the labor constituency workshop later on.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, my name's RJ. I'm with the Revolutionary Communist Youth Brigade. As someone that wants to really stop this war and stop this from ever happening again, I was wondering if people could speak to how people are doing things, not just to oppose, but to put themselves in the way and to stop what's going on. Whether it was the woman in Ireland who broke into a U.S. military base and dismantled a warplane, or whether it was students in New York and L.A. walking out of high schools. Or so, is there examples of librarians stopping, refusing to do this? Or?
Well, there are all kinds of direct actions that are being taken. I was at Jonah House when Phil Berrigan died on December 6th. Phil Berrigan is one of the leading peace activists in our time. And right about the time when he learned he had cancer in October, 3 women, 2 of them from Jonah House, Ardith Plati and Carol Gilbert, who were all nuns, went on to Air Force Base and hammered on warheads, as they have done so many times before. They're in the Georgetown jail in Colorado right now, and they face something like $250,000, $500,000 fine and decades in jail. And those kind of plowshares activists are engaged in actions all over the country. Then there are those who got arrested at School of the Americas base in Fort Benning. A number of them have arrested, sentenced. As well, there are people in New York and Washington and all over who have been walking out, who've been holding vigils, not necessarily being arrested, and many have been arrested. But people are taking action. What's amazing in this country, we're talking about hundreds of protests all over this country, whether it's young people walking out or librarians saying no to these FBI requests. It's very important that the media cover this and you learn about it, and that you go to the alternative websites so you can find out this information and see what people are doing.
Let me say that the Cleveland Nonviolence Network is looking at some things like that should war break out. And is there someone in the audience who could, anyone who wants to talk with folks like that? There's a website, is it cnvn.org? Is that right?
It's listed on the back of the program.
Okay, it's listed on the back of the program under day after actions. Okay, one more question.
More of a comment. I want to thank all the speakers and everybody that came today. Amy, getting on your poll thing, I heard somewhere only 35% of the people who are called actually respond to a poll. I've never been called. I wish they would call me. I want to talk about the moral high ground that our president says that we have. And I'm including presidents like Clinton, who fired a missile at a supposed al-Qaeda factory in Sudan, and it was actually an aspirin factory, and innocent people were killed there. And then recently in Yemen, we fired a missile that killed some supposed al-Qaeda supporters in a van. What kind of government, by assassination, are we becoming when we advocate things like that and the mass media says nothing about these kinds of things? It's a trial, it's a jury, it's a condemnation, it's a sentence, and then an execution, all in one. What are we coming to? This is ridiculous. And that's really what I'm trying to say, is where is the moral high ground when we do things like that?
Okay. Thank you. We're going to have to close questions here, and I apologize very much to anyone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question. The workshops here start in about 9 minutes. So when you leave this room, you can find stairways, turn either direction, go up 2 flights to the 2nd floor, and go this way to the bridge, and you'll be in the main classroom building, and then up 2 more flights to the 4th floor where the workshops, most of the workshops are. There are 2 people who want to say something here, so I'm going to let them do that.
I just wanted to let people know that we passed around an email sheet, if everyone would sign that so we can keep in touch with you. Also, we've got bumper stickers that say, "I want my democracy now," and also baseball caps that say, "Democracy now, the exception to the rule is made by United Food Commercial Workers." Union-made baseball caps, and they're in the back, and you can get them.
If you want the plain dealer to print a record of this tomorrow, the only way you're going to be able to do it is to get a message to the plain dealer. And here's what you should do when you get home. You send an email to Jim Nichols is the city editor over the weekend. So you send an email to jnichols@plaindeed.com. That's Nichols, jnichols@plaindeed.com, and say, report the conference. Okay.
If you want to catch Amy Goodman, there was a misprint in some of the information. It's WRUW 91.1, 9 a.m. Tuesday.
Hi, I'm a student from John Carroll University, and this Thursday, February 13th, in the main part of our university, we're sponsoring an event. Our justice organization, Stand in Solidarity with Iraqi Civilians. We'll have a peace vigil, letter writing campaign. All are welcome to attend, and we hope to see you there. 11 to 2, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., Thursday, February 13th, John Carroll University.
I'm looking for Shaker Heights residents willing to go to City Council on Monday evening, 7 p.m. to support a resolution against preemptive war in Iraq. I will take your names. I'll be in the back of the auditorium.
Then I can use my little position.
I'll take the mic if I have to, but look into that and say your name, Congressman, don't say the district, but say the area, so people understand that, and then talk about the resolution.
I'm Congressman Sherrod Brown. I represent. I'm Sherrod Brown. I represent. It was a resolution. It was actually a letter to Bush.
A letter to Bush. Okay. All right. Much better. Okay. Go ahead.
I'm Sherrod Brown. I represent Ohio's. Third I use it. Don't say the district. Okay.
It's okay. Just the areas of Ohio.
I'm Sherrod Brown. I'm a member of Congress representing Northeast Ohio, Lorraine, Akron, suburbs of Cleveland. In the last 2 weeks, anti-war efforts around the country, grassroots efforts, helped us get 120 plus signatures on a letter to President Bush saying, slow down, let the inspections work, containment, deterrence, diplomacy have worked to keep Saddam Hussein in check for the last 10 years. They're part of our military doctrine that has worked all over the world. They should be continued. Some 30 members of Congress who had voted for the Iraq resolution have also signed our letter encouraging the president to slow down and let the inspections work.
What do you make of the new Amber Alert, the heightening of alertness?
Obviously, when the Attorney General and the Homeland Defense Secretary put an alert out like that, people pay attention. This comes at the end of a week when Colin Powell spent much of the week and the national media spent much of the week outlining how bad Saddam Hussein is. We know he's bad. We know he's a dictator. We know he's a bad guy. But the fundamental question, will the U.S. be safer if we attack Iraq without UN support preemptively, has not been answered. And that question is pretty clearly no. The CIA says we're less safe. Retired generals have said we're less safe if we unilaterally attack Iraq.
Barbara Lee was the only Congress member to oppose an invasion right after September 11th, or to oppose war, military action. Given how you feel right now, why didn't you join in with that?
I think that since Afghanistan, lots of members of Congress and lots more Americans have understood that it's patriotic to oppose this war, that going into Iraq is a bad idea. I think that polls show 70% of the public opposes this. My mail is even in stronger opposition to that. I think people have realized that this war on terror has lost its focus, and that the attack on Iraq and the ignoring of North Korea are two very different things.
What do you think should happen with Iraq right now?
I think the U.S. military doctrine of containment and deterrence, which has been in effect in most cases for the last 50 years, has worked in Iraq. For 10 years, Saddam Hussein, partly because of the inspections, partly because of diplomacy, partly because of world opinion, partly because he's not as strong as he was, Saddam Hussein has attacked no one. He's a bad guy, but it's pretty clear that our policy with the inspections, with containment, with deterrence, with diplomacy have worked to keep him in check. There's no reason to attack now, back him into the corner, up against a wall, because that makes him more likely to do whatever to use whatever weapons he might have against Israel, against us, against his neighbors, against our troops, against his own people.
You were here at this Northeast Ohio Peace Coalition to encourage people to continue with their work, whether or not the U.S. invades Iraq. Can you talk as a Congress member about the impact of people rallying, people standing outside, people holding these kind of conferences?
All of us that have opposed this war, whether we're members of Congress, whether we're citizens that just care about this, all of us who oppose this war have had our patriotism called into question, whether it's on the House floor, whether it's in a TV interview, or whether it's in your workplace or your church or your neighborhood. It's important that people keep the heat on members of Congress, people that have supported the opposition to the war, and keep the heat on people in Congress who support this war. But keep the heat on them so that and help them develop a little more spine in standing up the administration and saying the best way to support the troops is not to send them to Iraq. The best way to support the troops is to bring them home.
Do you see the level of opposition that you are hearing from your constituents reflected in the mainstream media?
The level of opposition to this war from the public is not reflected in the media, and it's not reflected in Congress. I mean, the Washington Post this week looked like a Hearst newspaper trying to start the Spanish-American War. That's just one I saw. I've seen lots of papers that are just getting on this bandwagon where networks won't run TV ads, where the media has, for whatever reason, been part of this drumbeat for war. Politicians are not reflecting the public. The media are not reflecting the public. It's important that people speak out, give members of Congress more backbone, put pressure on us, make sure that people in Congress know and people in the media know how serious the opposition in this country to a unilateral kind of unprovoked attack against Iraq is.
Finally, the federal budget was introduced by the Bush administration this week, sent to Congress. What are your thoughts on it? There's very little discussion of connecting the two, the budget for war and the budget for, well, programs here at home.
The president's, for some reason, didn't put the war in his budget at all. I mean, it's already $300 billion out of balance. It's a tax cut for the richest people in the country. He's cutting programs for home heating assistance for the elderly poor. He's cutting education. He's not providing a decent prescription drug benefit. He's not able to do food safety, all the things that the public cares about because of this tax cut and because of this war. They're now lowballing the war, say it will only cost $50 billion. One Bush administration, high-ranked Bush administration official 4 months ago said it would cost $100 and $200 billion. He was fired 2 months later. Now the estimates are much smaller than that. Even with those estimates, they're not in the Bush budget. The fact is this war and the rebuilding after this war will run into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The president's not been honest about the budget. The president's not been honest about the cost of this war any more than he's been honest about the reasons for the build-up for the war.
Thanks for joining
Sure.
us.
Thank you. Thanks. What you ought to talk about. I just had a guy in my office with some research.
I saw him at an awards dinner. I said, do you agree with your network and all the other networks' policies of putting these retired military officers on the payroll to constantly comment
but not putting on the payroll peace activists and peace leaders, religious leaders in a community, community activists.